Hey everyone, welcome to Howdy, Theologian. This actually is episode 5. Elizabeth got a little, quick on the draw, but we are here with episode 5. Last week, we talked about worship. Any questions you have, Elizabeth, about worship?
I got a question.
Whoa.
I got a question.
Who is that? Just kidding.
This
That's not Dexter.
From behind the camera.
Yeah, our
Hey,
producer.
Y'all talked a lot about worshiping God last week, and you talked about how you can't worship God in like nature and all that type of stuff. But a question I have is, what's the difference between worshiping and experiencing God?
You want to take it, Elizabeth?
I think worship is an intentional response to an experience of God. So, yeah, first of all, you can worship God in nature, but it's different than just being, walking around and being like, oh my gosh, that sunset's so beautiful. That's maybe a fact and it evokes an emotion,
Or it could be an experience of God.
and it could be an experience of God, right? And of God's grace. And then worship is an intentional
Response
time
to that.
set aside, designated, where you say, okay, I am going to worship God now. And whatever that might look like, whether that's kneeling or praying or closing your eyes or, all sorts of things. People worship in all sorts of postures.
Yes.
But it is a intentional set aside response to an experience that you have of God.
I agree with that. Which requires something of us.
Yeah, and it requires something of us. Walking around and being like, I'm so thankful for this is great. But that doesn't require you to do anything. You can just have that feeling of gratitude. But to worship, I think, requires something of us. And that's why we're going to talk about sacrifice today. Because I think sacrifice is kind of a scary word. I think when you think of sacrifice, what do you think of?
Sacrifice bunt.
In baseball? Oh my gosh, that took me a long time to mentally get where you were going. I was like, what? Because I went to cake first, I guess.
A bunt cake? A sacrifice bunt cake?
I was very confused.
All right, Dexter, roll the thing. Let's get into it.
Let me tell you the best advice I ever got at Harvard. You want to be great? You need to sacrifice. The more painful the sacrifice, the greater you'll be.
You just got to sacrifice more. If you sacrifice more, you'll be greater, Elizabeth.
It's got to be painful too, right?
Yeah, from the great movie Blackberry. I think it came out last year. It's about a blackberry bush.
Oh my gosh. Baseball and blackberry bushes. Okay.
A real American Pie type of episode.
Yeah, we're on the
We're
same
talking about
wavelength here.
sacrifice. Yeah, no. When I really think about sacrifice, I think it's hard not to go to Saving Private Ryan or some war film, right? Where you're sort of driven into the notion of patriotism and
the ultimate sacrifice.
The ultimate sacrifice, right?
Yeah. I think ultimately I think why I think it's a scary word for us is because it seems to involve pain. Right? We talk about you gotta blood, sweat, and tears, leave it in the ring, this ultimate sacrifice, give your life, cut it out of you, give it, it feels like it requires pain. And in this such a twisted way, I think it comes from, there has been ritual sacrifice for almost as long as I think they have evidence of human existence.
Sure.
Right? We have evidence of some type of offerings, and those offerings require the giving up of and often require blood.
Right, because if you want the ultimate, you've got to pay the
Blessing.
ultimate price.
Right.
Point Break. Great movie.
Okay.
You know that movie? Point Break?
Wait, is that the surfing one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is with the surfing one.
This is weird.
Yeah.
I read a book that talked about Point Break, but I've actually never seen Point Break.
Bodhi says if you want the ultimate, you got to pay the ultimate price.
Which is what? Your life?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people who are, it's like a risk, right? I mean, you gotta
risk it all.
The greatest reward comes from like the greatest risk.
Well, I mean, the notion of sacrifice is that, yes, to sort of obtain, I guess religiously, to obtain like God's blessing, you have to give something up.
Yeah.
To obtain God's favor, to obtain God's sort of.
And let's be clear, it happened in every religion. So it's not just like a Judeo-Christian practice.
Totally.
But I mean, for our faith, that's certainly, we have these like these root kind of core identity producing stories within our own scriptures that, I mean, like one of the first big conflicts between two humans between two brothers who sacrifice two different things, and one is regarded by God and the other one isn't.
Right.
And so then it's like, well, one sacrifice is better than the other, and that like creates this whole thing.
Yeah.
This whole like conflict, this whole like horrible situation.
So I think because the word sacrifice has such like is so loaded in terms of its like religious sort of undertones, right? I mean, I think it's hard to often be like, well, what does that look like for us today outside of being a soldier who goes to war, right? But I was thinking about this episode. I've actually been thinking about this a lot because I wonder if, like, I don't know, I did a lot of self-reflection. Like, do I actually sacrifice anything?
Yeah.
And do you like Ken Burns?
Yeah.
You kind of get... No, that wasn't convincing.
I mean, it's not like I'm like, oh my God, Kim Burns, but
Really?
Yeah, I like the work he does. I think it's good.
Love Ken Burns.
That's wonderful.
Love him. Baseball. Speaking of baseball, his documentary on baseball is so good.
Okay, I knew that he did that.
Yeah, it's.
I didn't watch it. But
he put a documentary together about Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
And so I think reframing sacrifice is like something we get to choose rather than something that's chosen for us,
or like extracted
or
from
expected from us,
yeah.
right? Like, no doubt there was great sacrifice made, by soldiers in Vietnam, and yet that so many of them didn't have a choice, right? Mm-hmm. So like when given the opportunity to choose, comfort versus sacrifice or security versus sacrifice, like Muhammad Ali popped into my head, and we have this clip of Ken Burns' documentary.
I'm asking you if you apologize for the unpatriotic remarks that you made.
Anything, I'm not apologizing for nothing like that because I don't have to. I'm apologizing to the people who in charge of the selective service. Those are the people that we'll take this up with. I'm not in court now for that. I'm a champ of the world. This is athletic commissioner, and I'm here to fight for the title, and I'm just apologizing for what I said to the newspapers and to the press when I should have had these things to say, and they will from now on be said with the people who are in charge of this.
Mr. Clay, when
Muhammad Ali, sir.
Mr. Clay,
Muhammad Ali, sir.
Mr. Muhammad Ali, either
yes,
one.
Just Muhammad Ali.
When you appeared before this commission before, if I recall correctly, you said you were the people's champion?
Yes, sir.
Do you think that you're acting like a people's champion?
Yes, sir.
I was born by
That same day, the Illinois Attorney General declared the fight illegal.
Oh, I get chills. Like, there's such conviction. You can see it in Muhammad Ali. Maybe it's a little easier to be that sort of convicted when you are, like, literally the greatest fighter of all time. But, like, it was so costly for him to, like, take a position and refuse to, like, bend even like it cost him so much. Definitely in the court of public opinion, like there weren't a lot of Muhammad Ali fans at the time. And now looking back, we get to talk about how great he was and how important his sort of stand was. But like sacrifice, I think when we choose it, it requires that sort of confidence and commitment to something that is ultimately going to cost us.
Yeah.
I don't think there's sacrifice without it costing us something.
Yeah.
So when we reframe sacrifice to sort of a modern day expression, we can talk about Jesus and what happened on the cross for sure, how we're invited in to participate into the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is sort of a call for us as Christians to participate in sacrifice. But I struggle with like thinking about like, well, what does that actually look like in my own life?
When I think of worship requiring something of us, I think of how to worship God requires us to focus on God, which sounds obvious maybe, but think of how hard that actually is. Yeah. I mean, when you worship God, it's really hard to focus on God and not on what you look like or what you sound like or what you're doing or what other people think of you or
what you like,
what is comfortable for you and what's easy for you. And, what am I going to have for lunch later? Like, I mean, I just think, I think worship requires us to think not of ourselves. And that is a sacrifice. Like we have to sacrifice our own self-attention, our own self-consciousness. Like we have to give up whatever like coolness or persona or, way that we like to show up in the world. And we have to focus on God. And it does require time. I mean, we talk about coming to worship regularly. That's time out of your day that you give up to go and gather with others and worship God. Yeah. I mean, we have like an offering within worship, not of blood or flesh or anything like that. But I mean, we invite people to offer their resources and to respond in gratitude to what God has done by giving of their resources. So time and energy and resources and, attention. And I mean, I think when we worship and when we are willing to think of God and who God is and what God has done and what God is calling us to do, I think it does take something from us. And I think we have to be willing to give up, even if it's something as simple as a slow morning at home with a cup of coffee, and the kids, doing whatever. Or, I mean, I just think there's something that it requires of us always. And we maybe forget that. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there are times when I need to do something to get me out of myself more than like I typically do. And that's why I even think of like the season of Lent as a time. I used to think,
my favorite season.
I know you're such an Enneagram 4. Love Lent.
Love it.
But think of what Lent, it's literally a time where we give something up, right? We sacrifice some pleasure or habit or benefit or, enjoyment kind of for the season of penitence. And it's connected to penitence. But I mean, the idea, I used to think though that, well, why would I have to give something up? Like Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice, so I wouldn't have to.
He paid the ultimate price.
Right. But you could go back and listen to our episodes on atonement, which
we're not going to talk about
we're not going to dive into all that. But I do think though that when we are willing to say, you know what, I need to get out of myself maybe a little bit more than I have been.
Yeah.
I need something to help me be a little bit more aware of how I'm showing up in the world.
Sure.
And remind me a little bit more regularly of who God is.
Well,
then I would be willing to sacrifice more or give up something of value more.
Well, I think that's what worship does. It kind of gets us to a place where we sort of then pull out the experience, we stretch it over our week, right? And so we live more sacrificially throughout the week. Like if we can learn that sacrifice in and of itself is sort of a trait of what it means to follow Christ, then we can see how we're willing to sacrifice outside of a worship. We can begin to sacrifice on behalf of others in our day-to-day life, which is connected to our faith. I just really struggle with this idea that the gospel is a costly one. Like Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace and costly grace,
right.
And like God's grace demands something from us. We don't have to give anything to receive it, but once we receive it, there's sort of this conviction that I think goes along with it. And like I look at my life sometimes, I'm like, I don't know, like it's kind of pretty good. I'm not really making a ton of sacrifices. Like I can reframe a bunch of stuff, but I don't always feel like I'm like consciously willing to forego or give something so that
But let me say it this way. I mean, you said that when we receive grace, there's like this conviction then that we want to then respond to that.
Sure.
And we're willing to kind of make the sacrifice. Yeah. And you look at, I mean, Muhammad Ali, I mean, that's part of what he did, right? I mean, he was so convicted and so confident in what he knew to be true that the sacrifice maybe was actually easy. And I don't know
that's true.
Because it's like so when you are so convicted of the truth or the reality or the goodness or the grace or like this kind of this choice, then it's almost like it is a choice, but it's easier to make because
we're convicted.
You're so convicted of
totally.
it. And you look at, yes, there were so many people who made the ultimate sacrifice because they were drafted and had to go, serve. But there were a lot of acts of courage and over bravery, and above that where people sacrificed truly for the sake of their siblings, for their, brothers and sisters in arms. And, and then there's these moments where it's like, I'm so convicted of this that it may seem like a huge sacrifice to someone else, but because of how strongly I feel,
it wasn't an option.
It's
right?
actually like, I mean, it is an option, but it's like, but of course I'm going to do that.
Yeah, totally.
Right? I mean, so it's like your kid. Like, think about your kids. If you sacrifice so many things for your kids.
That's true.
Right? But like, of course we do, because we're so convicted in our love for them and we're so aware
I think that's a really
that
good
they
point.
depend on us. So like when we are so convicted of God's grace and love for us, then the sacrifice is like, of course we'll sacrifice this.
Yeah.
Of course we'll, commit to this career that,
sure, is
challenging and is demanding of us that other people look at this and think that's crazy. Why would you be in ministry? With the state of the church these days. And you're like, well, you're not wrong, but there's something like we're so convicted of it that you take these steps
I think
that
that's
again
a good point.
Seem like a sacrifice to others. But they're obvious for us.
Yeah.
For you.
Yeah. No, that I appreciate that. That's really helpful in reframing it because there are things that I think I do or we do in our as a family that others would think is like really sacrificial, and maybe it is, but we just do it because we're convicted about it, right? Like filling out a pledge card.
Yeah, exactly.
Giving thousands of dollars to the church, right?
Yeah.
Like I can get there. I guess my concern is that we can become complacent and not look for opportunities or pass by opportunities where we're asking to be more and more sacrificial in our, I don't know, daily lives because we either think we've given enough or because we are not aware. And so I really appreciate connecting sacrifice back to worship, because it pulls us out of the like dangerous cycle that is like self-obsession, right?
Well,
and our culture like expects that from us. Our algorithms promote that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's, I think that is a hard thing to be able to sort of correct on your own, and we need to constantly guard against being too self-involved.
Yeah.
And too concerned about self.
Well, and that's why I think worship in like a regular habitual way is important, because every week we're reminded
regardless,
about
right?
sacrifice.
It's the
Yeah,
same
and
thing
have the
as like,
opportunity. And then Lent as a season of the church, a time when we are intentionally focused on what does it mean to give up? What does it mean to sacrifice? So, I mean, I think there are ways that the church, in its kind of rhythm and through worship and through the seasons, kind of helps to call it to mind, right? And puts it before us once again. Wait, oh, this was an obvious, oh yeah, I gave or I sacrificed this last year or this year. Okay, does it look like to sacrifice now? To give now again, and to give more or less or differently or whatever. I mean, like there's that question, I think, that we're regularly confronted with when we participate in regular worship and in the seasons of the church like Lent, that remind us like, okay, this is our chance to kind of re-examine what our sacrifice has been, and kind of decide whether or not we need to engage in it again, and to maybe engage in it further. You know, I think sacrifice is so, I mean, I think it's scary and it's dramatic, and it's like, I really ultimately think though it cannot be forced, because then it's not sacrifice, it's like payment. And a sacrifice, I mean, I think that's where so much of our scriptural stories, when they refer to like sacrifice, has just become like this rote thing that, you know, you kind of have to do, and it has become this thing that you have to check off, you know, and fill out the thing, and you take your dove or your, you know, goat or sheep or whatever, your lamb, and your sacrifice. I mean, and it's like this very like, okay, and here's your temple like money, and you know, you have to exchange everything, and it like has to be perfect, and it has to be like really of a certain value, you know, all these things. And it was like this, all these like requirements of it. When you read the scriptures, like we talked about last week about like, you know, I don't desire your burnt offerings. Those stink. Like I want something real from you. And it's justice, right? And it's mercy, and it's kindness, and it's generosity, and it's, you know, the things that actually look like Jesus. Not just this kind of perfect little item that you check off the box. And I don't know. I also then, not to go too far back to the atonement, but I do feel like
we did say we weren't going to rehash that.
I know, but this is really important, because I think that it's important. Then I just don't think we can say, there's so much theology that I'm going to like just drop right here, but I don't think that God required or demanded Jesus to be sacrificed. I mean,
no,
I think that was Jesus's choice to freely sacrifice himself and allow himself to be killed.
Agreed.
And so that's why it was so powerful, is because Jesus was so convicted in who he was and what God had called him to do. That he allowed himself, that he refused to deny it, and continued down this path that he knew would lead to crucifixion. And that conviction then, I mean, it was horrible and hard, but it also was like, I mean, he did it. You know, I mean, like he just was like, yeah, I'm not wavering. I'm not running away. I'm not wringing my hands. Like he knew that it was happening, and he went towards it. And there's like a willingness there.
Yes.
I mean, he knew what the cost was.
I agree. I think this opens a whole nother can of worms, though. and maybe we should save it for another episode and talk about violence. But I struggle a lot with how much freedom Christ had versus how much the context in which Christ's ministry was like taking place applied the crucifixion to, right? Because there's a part of me that is really fascinated by like society's like killing of God because it was too radical. And like the self-emptying nature of the cross, I think, begs a question of like, how complicit is humanity in the death of God? You know, like, what role did we have play? Did we play any? Did Jesus really have ultimate freedom to choose or not to choose? Or was the ultimate freedom in just a choice to become human, and then it was intermingled with our own free will, right? So it's sort of messy to pull apart, but I am right there with you thinking like there had to be other avenues that could have been pursued, and ultimately God understood what it meant to go all the way to the cross.
I think there's something different between someone taking something from you and you freely offering it.
Yeah.
And one is more powerful.
Absolutely.
Than the other.
No doubt.
When it comes to being in a relationship. If someone takes something from me in a relationship.
That's not sacrifice. That is robbery.
Yeah.
I mean,
theft.
Theft, right? Yeah. Like,
yeah.
I think there has to be a willingness to sacrifice, right? And I think that's also gets to generosity, right?
Yeah.
You know, we're getting into a stewardship campaign, and there are folks who fill out a pledge card, and like, I know that it's a struggle. Like, I know that that's like a real sacrifice to give to the church. And there are folks who fill out a pledge card who, right, pledge card's like way larger than the person who's struggling. And it's not a struggle, right? It's not a sacrifice. And I think like that's the challenge. That's the work we all have to do, is like be willing to sort of sacrifice on behalf of what we believe. And there is something costly about the gospel, and the minute we stop seeing the gospel as costly, I think is the minute that we've turned it into sort of a empowering sort of, I do this because it makes me feel good, or right, like,
yeah.
Just like becomes, I don't know, thin, becomes artificial.
Yeah,
I don't know what word I'm looking for here, but there's something that I think is required of us to sort of be willing to sacrifice on behalf of what we believe.
I want to be a little cautious, because I do think that sometimes sacrifice becomes its own
an idol.
Like, yeah, it becomes something that we actually like, kind of in a twisted way, get pleasure from. And there can be a lot of self-righteousness that comes with sacrifice, and a lot of I mean that's the whole, like, even when I think like physically, like the notion of self-flagellation, where it's like, I beat myself, I hurt myself in order to like gain connection to Christ who suffered. And like, I mean, I don't know, did you ever read the Da Vinci Code?
Yeah.
You know that book?
Yeah, duh.
Duh.
Didn't everyone?
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it. I remember being like, I cannot like put this down, right?
What was the next one? Good. Angels and Demons?
Yeah, I don't think I read that one, honestly. The first one was so good. But it was like, there was that character, and I can't even remember like what he was. I think he was an albino monk or something.
Okay.
And he like, but he like had that like contraption on his leg that he would like tighten the screws in, literally, to like hurt himself.
Yeah.
And it was like whenever he did something that he felt guilty for, then he would like turn it to be like, I got to sacrifice to like atone and like, and it's like, you know, this notion of, again, like focusing so much on Jesus's suffering that like you like try to take on that suffering yourself. And that to me is like, again, it's almost like we've made sacrifice like something, again, about us. We've made it about us and not actually about God. We've made it about us. And it's not something that then takes us out of ourselves.
I agree.
And like gives it like, you know, joyfully offers it to God. It's something that then like we're like hurting.
I totally agree. And I think then the best way to end this is to actually go back to what you originally said, right? Because when we are properly aligned, sacrifice doesn't feel like sacrifice. It feels like conviction and confidence, right? Like if we're waffling, like, should I do X, Y, or Z, right? Like,
we need to spend some time
discerning, right?
Yeah.
But the more we can become convicted by what God's doing in our life, the more confident we can be, even if it is costly.
Yeah.
So, well, hey, let's talk about violence next time.
Yeah. Violence. I did a whole independent study on the theology of violence in college.
What grade did you get?
An A+. I'm so violent.
Y'all got graded for independent studies?
No, I passed. I don't.
In undergrad?
Yeah, in undergrad.
Wow.
The theology of violence.
Well, dust off the old syllabus, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Bring it with us next time. Friends, thanks for listening to Howdy, Theologian. It is a podcast for all who want to better understand theology from a progressive perspective. Elizabeth and I are pastors at First United Methodist Church here in Dallas. Like or subscribe. Smash that subscribe button. You can join us worshiping here on Sunday mornings in person or online. And make sure you share this episode with a friend who needs to understand sacrifice better. We'll see you in just a few days next week.